Hello class, we're going to be talking about Fearon and Laitin today, right, and the two articles that are assigned for March 31st. The first one is Fearon and Laitin's article about ethnicity, insurgency, and civil war. So one of the things that we noticed in the 90s was that while international war, interstate war, was in decline, we saw other types of conflict increase. We see here that interstate war, right, there were 25 interstate wars and 3.3 million battle deaths between 1945 and 1999. And they had a very short duration, about less than 3 months. When we look at civil war, we see that the number of conflicts was 127, the number of battle deaths was 16.2 million, so more than 5 times as much, and they had very long durations, about 6 years. What this means is that civil wars, not only are they more likely and they're more common, but they also last a lot longer and they lead to a lot more battle deaths. So when we're talking about this, we want to make sure that we're focusing on civil war right now. And the important part about Fearon and Laitin's article is that civil war has often been blamed for some conventional wisdom arguments. And I mean conventional wisdom is something that just became accepted, that they're challenged in the 90s. So let's talk about what this conventional wisdom was before this article comes out. And remember, these are in the 90s, early 2000s, so the conventional wisdom of then is not the conventional wisdom of today. The first part that we notice about the conventional wisdom is that a lot of things were considered tightened during the Cold War. So during the period of the Cold War, you saw the Soviet Union and the US in combat, but what they would do is the argument is that they were suppressing all of these other conflicts, right? That all these other conflicts weren't occurring because of the Cold War. So if you weren't allied with the Soviets and if you weren't allied with the US, right, then you weren't going to go into conflict. And the US and the Soviets were going to sort of contain any other conflicts that were occurring. That was the sort of prevailing wisdom of the time. What we see is that civil wars start to accumulate after 1945, continuing into 1999. So it's not like right after the Cold War you have this outbreak of a lot of conflicts, that these conflicts were occurring during both time periods, right, pre and post the Cold War. So you have some conflicts that happened after 1945, we know, because there's a big anti-colonial push, specifically Algiers, right? It wants to be independent from France. So some of these conflicts are after the World War II period, but the Cold War is not having the impact that we think. The next argument, which we're going to spend most of the article talking about, is that there was an underlying belief that if you had a lot of ethnic or religious diversity, that you would have more conflict, that you're more likely to see conflict if the number of different ethnic communities and this sort of divisions between those communities were larger, than you're more likely to see conflict. And the other part was that these cleavages, right? How big is the cleavage? Are you Sunni and Shia, right? It's a religious cleavage that's quite large. Are you, right, Hutu and Tutsi, these very different groups, right? What groups are there? How big are the cleavages, right? Is one put into power from its sort of colonial past and it's not the majority, or it has some claim to rule for some reason, right? And a lot of the conventional wisdom that is if you had two ethnic cleavages and they were large and distinct, that you'd have more likely to have conflict. And Fearon and Laitin are going to challenge this. So before we get into that, let's talk about some of the terminology that we're going to use in this section. The first part is insurgency. So remember, when we're talking about civil wars, we're talking about rebel groups, when we're talking about sub-national conflict, the insurgency is going to be this very small, very lightly armed bands that are engaging in guerrilla warfare from rural bases. So let's unpack that a little bit. Lightly armed means machine guns are smaller, right? They don't have tanks, they don't have aircraft, they don't have a lot of the larger military equipment. They're also not fighting sort of blind frontline style fighting. They're harassment attacks, they're hiding, right? And this is also why they have rural bases. They need to be away from city centers. They need to be in parts that aren't easily accessible. And we'll talk about that more when we get into a little bit later in this video. The next part is state capacity. So when we're talking about insurgency, we always have to do relative to state capacity. So state capacity can mean a lot of things, but for us, we're going to be talking about the financial and organizational ability to respond to a crisis. So the first part is financial. Can the state pay for a military? Can the state pay for counterinsurgency? Does it have better military equipment? Can it redress grievances, right? Can it redistribute taxes? These are all the financial abilities. And then organizational ability has a lot to do with bureaucracy. And what bureaucracy does is it sort of puts in procedure into place. So instead of you having what we call a clientelist network, where you're just helping your friends, right, and you're helping people part of your ethnic group, do you have this organizational ability and this bureaucracy to respond by a standardized process, right? If someone needs something, do they go through a normal bureaucracy, or do they have to know someone? Do they have to bribe someone, right? And the greater the organizational capacity, the greater the state capacity, and the better they are able to maintain the rule of law. And the main rule of law is not just, do you have the finances to do it, but is your system organized? Is your state organized such that you respond to things in a very formulated way instead of a very sort of patronage way, where if you scratch my back, I provide for you, right? That's patronage, right? You do something for me, I do something for you. The other part about rural braces that we talked about in this, at the very beginning of this slide, is that rough terrain is any land that is inaccessible to armored vehicles or aerial reconnaissance. This could be a mountain range, this could be jungle cover, and what that does is it takes away the advantage that the state has. If I can't drive tanks into this mountain range, then it's going to be harder for me to fight off this rebel group. So rough terrain is very important. We're talking about insurgency in large part because you expect rough terrain to give the advantage to those engaging in guerrilla warfare. If you're talking about flat roads and sort of empty plains, then that's going to give the advantage to aircraft and tanks and sort of military technology. This other part we're going to talk about later in the course, right, has to do with foreign bases, financial support, and training. So if you have a base on the other side of a state border, that's going to give you an advantage, right? Because we talked about this, you don't want to cross a state border because that other state might consider that a declaration of war. So if you have a terror group or an insurgent group or any type of rebel group and they're operating on the other side of a border, you have to be very careful to prevent them from using that to cause you to have a problem with the state that you border. And the other part is financial support and training. Sometimes we talk about state-sponsored terrorism. Excuse me one second. So state-sponsored terrorism has a lot to do with a group being funded by a state, but the state's not engaging directly in combat. And so when we're talking about an insurgency, if its financial support comes from another factor, another actor, or it's coming from another state, that's going to change this functionality, because we always have this argument that the state is more powerful, but if you have an insurgency that's being funded by another state, then it's going to cause problems. And that's something we'll talk about later in the course, but I want you to be aware of it. So let's talk about in the article. Sorry, I'm changing a bit, but I want to be very clear about this. In the article that we're talking about, the Fearon and Laitin ethnic conflict, ethnic issues, insurgency, right? We're talking about this article. There's specific data in the article, and they code this a certain way. And we'll talk about this sort of like research methodology in a second. But we want to be sure that we're talking about actual conflicts, right? Remember, conflict is violent and armed, right? So the armed groups, and it's measured in battle deaths. So when they're talking about civil war, they're including, right, that both groups are trying to take control of the territory, right? As a rebel group, and they're like, hey, we want to be independent, right? Is this Algeria saying we don't want to be part of France or Northern Africa or a different community? We don't want to be French, right? That's two groups, right? The French and the Algiers groups fighting against each other. Or it could just be to change a policy. Sometimes when you have two groups competing, they might just be about changing something about the government. A lot of socialist movements are about more redistribution of wealth, that you need to start giving more to the communities that are rural communities, right? They're not looking to be separate or independent from the existing state, but they do want to change. Then we want to make sure that we're talking about at least 1,000 battle deaths. So we want to have a large enough conflict that it matters, that it applies to what we're talking about in IR. And I mean matter in the sense that we can codify it as a conflict, right? It matters that the conflict was occurring, not this normative aspect of whether or not it matters that people are dying, right? We don't get into that. I'm not trained in that. We don't want to make sure that this is a sustained conflict, so the threshold for this data set is at least 100 battle deaths each year. Now, we've talked about this before, that in other data sets, You have a 25 battle death threshold, right? This is the PRIO data set, right? This is sort of the very commonly used today was this 25 battle death threshold to say that's a conflict when we're talking about subnational conflict. They decide to use 100 each year. So they're talking about a larger civil war, and they mean civil wars in fact that the same way that you would think of a civil war, right? Two factions really going to at it. So you want at least 100 deaths each year, and if you have it drop below 100 deaths, that would be sort of the end of that conflict, and you have another conflict. So if it's 100 each year, right, either it has to be really big one year or sustained over up to 10 years. And we see that there's still a lot of cases. We talked about this earlier, that there were 127 different cases over that 45-year period, 55-year period, talked about in this sort of cases slide. This also includes anti-colonial wars and wars of independence. So one of the things is a lot of people have excluded anti-colonial wars because after 1945 you had a lot of former colonies that fought their sort of colonial empires for independence. And they've been excluded because we know why they're different. We know that they are different because the world changed and all of a sudden the norms changed so that no one should be a colony and every state should be independent. And a lot of data sets have said, let's exclude that and let's consider that extra systematic wars. We're talking about those that are colonies that are fighting for independence. But when we're talking about civil wars, we want to test this assumption about it being the difference between the ethnicity or the religion or the identity of two groups. And so colonial wars fit with that because you do have a difference in identity. You have difference in ethnicity, right? The French are not the Algerians. The Hutus are not the Tutsis, they're different, and so anti-colonial wars have to be included because they are two separate groups, and that's part of what we're testing. And wars of independence fit the same way, right? If we're talking about the former Czechoslovakia, right, they were two groups, they fought independence, right? Pakistan fights for independence from India, right? These are independence conflicts, but they're based on, right, when we're using these in the data, we're talking about something that's based on a difference of identity, right? How do they identify, and is that really what's driving it? And the Fearon and Laitin are testing, do we think what's driving it is actually driving it? We talked about the conventional wisdom. Let's test to see if that's driving it. So they come up with some testable hypotheses. The first one is that what we expect in the conventional wisdom, that you have ethnic religious diversity, that's going to lead to a higher risk of conflict, right? We want to test that. We're going to include that, and we'll talk about that later when we're going through. The second part is what they think is a bigger factor is that income really matters, right? Are you making more money? Are you providing, right? And as income increases, the impact of diversity for them is argued to be greater, right? The more resources you have to distribute, the more income people are making, the more they're willing to fight over this, right? This is the greed model that they talk about. The more there is to fight over, the more likely there is to be a fight. So if you're all living under poverty, right, that's sort of the case of India, is that we're all living under poverty, there's nothing to fight for, so we just work together. But if you have more wealth, right, especially like resource wealth, like oil, you might be willing to fight over that control over that resource. The next part is we have to think about the size of the ethnic groups, right? If you have one ethnic majority, right, say 50% of the population is one grouping, and then you have like 10 to 20% that's another group, you have a very sizable majority and you have a sizable ethnic minority. And I don't like to use the US case, but I think this will be the really clear example. When we talk about race relations in the United States, we're really talking about whites and blacks. Why? It is not because there is a greater division between those two groups. It is because the majority is white and black is a sizable ethnic minority, right? They're a racial minority, but I'm using this example for a reason, right? It is the percentage, whether it's 8 to 10% of the population, right? One, Americans often overestimate that, but two, you have a percentage of one group and you have a percentage of another group. And so when you see discrimination, you see the majority, right? The white majority in the United States using discrimination against the ethnic minority, the racial minority, the blacks in the United States, right? It's 8 to 10%. So when we're talking about this internationally in an IR case, we want to look at those cases where there's about 8 to 10% or higher as the minority and 50% as the majority. And what you will see is that the majority will often vote or choose, right, if they're an authoritarian regime, to discriminate against the minority in order to benefit their group. And so this can be a strong sort of force for conflict. And so we want to use those cases and that argument sort of separately than the other hypothesis we've discussed. Now we need to know what different groups exist. So there's a couple of ways that we can see, okay, how divided is our society? So the first one is called ethno-linguistic fractionalization. It's very common, it's still used today. And basically you split out all of the groups, the ethno-linguistic groups. And we say ethno-linguistic because usually if you speak a different language or a different group, we've talked about this in the last few slides, in the last few lectures, excuse me, right? And the way that you find the ethno-linguistic fractionalization is you pull two individuals from a population and you say, what's the probability that these two individuals come from a different group, right? If I pull from the United States and I pull two people, what's the likelihood that they don't share an identity? And so the higher that number is, right, whether it's just the number of groups is larger, there might be 10 ethnic groups or 10 different ethno-linguistic groups in a population, and so you might have a different percentage, but the higher the probability that those two individuals are a separate group, we expect that conflict to be more likely in that population. The other part is just a percentage of the population that is part of the major ethnic group. So if you have a state, and in that population, right, of that state, 80% is one group and 20% is another group, then you might think there might be more conflict, right? Because that very large majority might be trying to suppress a minority, and that minority might decide that because they can't engage in the government, because they can't appeal to the government for their issues, that they might want to be independent, right? They might want to form a separate state, as we've seen in multiple cases, right? Czechoslovakia breaks up into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. You might have Pakistan saying we are different, right? That is a Muslim community. They want to have their own state and their own rules, right? So that's a war of independence because they're a minority in a much larger state with a non-Muslim majority population. And so arguing about this. And then the sort of the easier way that we've seen a lot of this, because it's a very clear-cut way, is the number of distinct languages. And it has to be at least 1% of the population, but if you think about some African countries, one of the problems that we run into, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, is that language is actually much more diverse in the African continent. And so you have more linguistic divides in Africa. But that doesn't mean that you're more likely to have more conflict. It's actually because the societies are a little older, right? And as you have older societies, you have more diversity of languages. When you see newer societies like the United States, right, you have this cohesion of language because it comes along with certain technology like the printed press, and to get information you sort of have this forced cohesion because you're getting information on a wide scale. So we do see greater linguistic divisions in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, but that's more to do with the fact that people have lived there longer, right? We're from Nevada. Our culture is very, very new because we haven't lived here until the 20th century, right? It was very, very difficult to live in Las Vegas before the invention of air conditioning and irrigation and other, running water factors like that. So they talk about the data. So let's clear up some terminology. These are things you'll go over in 302, but I want you to sort of get this idea of how we go from these arguments to sort of testable data, because this really matters for what we're making the argument for, because Fearon and Laitin make a really good point, but they do it with data rather than argument. So the first thing is a dummy variable. Everyone should know what a dummy variable is, but we talked a lot about binary last time, right? Is it a binary? What does it mean to be a binary? So a dummy variable is a binary, right? You only have two possible options. It can be 0, 1, it can be yes, no, or it can be male, female. This is why I talked about it being so important we understand this, right? You only have two categories in a dummy variable, male and female, right? We talked about this, we talked about feminism. If you only have two categories, male and female, right, then your data is going to show a divide between those two groups if there is a divide between those two groups. But if you want to do a sort of a spectrum, you're going to miss that with a binary. So depending on how you sort of look at the data, right, how do you categorize this, right, it's going to lead you to different conclusions. So how do you go from an argument, what we would call a concept, to get to this sort of data process? So you start with a concept, this idea that ethnicity does have a role in conflict. So how does it have a role? And that goes through to operationalize, right? To operationalize means to take a concept and turn it into some testable variable. So that's taking, right, this idea that ethnic diversity, this concept of ethnic diversity leads to conflict, and then we need to use that terminology that fractionalization, right? How divided are those groups? And so that creates a mechanism. And you say the way that conflict is more likely is through this mechanism or variable where division occurs by ethnic fractionalization, right? Or what Fearon and Laitin actually talk about is this idea of per capita income. So then we have more testable hypotheses. I'm not going to spend too much time on them. I want to do this all in one video. So they do make an argument that democracy, right, if you're a democratic state, you're less likely to have conflict. If you have greater civil liberties, you're less likely to have conflict. If you have discrimination or income equality, you might have more conflict. So what matters is they're saying it's not the ethnic division, it's not the diversity of the state, it's all of these other things. Right, you have a lot of diversity, but is that causing the conflict, or is it that you actively suppress one group? Right, if your civil liberties are set up in such a way where you're discriminating purposely against one group, then that group is more likely to see conflict. But that has nothing to do with ethnic division, but it has to do with governmental policy. And that's one of the big arguments they make. The other part, right, they do talk about the size in the minority, right, and right, there's a rough terrain and state capacity. So what they argue is in the first few hypotheses we saw earlier is that ethnic division might matter. What they are arguing here is that it's not really ethnic division. This is what really matters for us as we move forward. It's not really about the diversity of the community or this population of the state. It has a lot more to do with these things that are called permissive conditions, right? Permissive conditions means it doesn't really cause it to occur, but it allows it to be more likely. And that's very clear in the last two, this rough terrain and state capacity. If you have rough terrain, it will be harder for the state control an area, right? A mountain range is harder to control than a plains. An open highland area is harder to control than a deep jungle. So rough terrain benefits insurgency because the rebel groups are typically much weaker than the state. But if the state can't access that terrain for whatever reason, then it gives that advantage to the insurgency, which the insurgency can be more successful. They're less likely to get captured and killed, right? So they're more willing to fight, right? That cost-benefit analysis. Remember, this is rational choice. So they're doing an analysis, right? Can I fight? Will I fight, right? If you are very likely to get destroyed, then you're not going to fight. But if you're like, hey, I can hide out in the jungle and I can do these harassing attacks and trying to get a change in policy, that's a more likely consideration, and rational choice says the benefits are more likely, the reward is more likely, and the cost is lower with this rough terrain. State capacity is the other part, because a lot of times when you have rough terrain, one of the things that's missing is roads. And the more roads you build, the more infrastructure you build, the easier it is to go through rough terrain. So a state, even if it has sort of natural rough terrain, a state with more mountain ranges, right? If we look at sort of South America, more rough terrain exists in their environment, but they can build roads and they can build infrastructure that gets rid of that. If we look at the southern part of Africa, really great roads, really great infrastructure, and you do have a decline in insurgency and rebel groups, violent groups, because the military is much easier to travel in that process, right? Apartheid is clearly discriminatory in South Africa, but the roads and the infrastructure is so good, and the counterinsurgency programs are so well trained and funded in South Africa that you just don't have as much violent opposition, right? You have some peaceful opposition, but violent opposition, the part we're concerned about, armed conflict, doesn't exist because of that state capacity. So now, right, if you're looking at this, right, if you want to take a second, I'm talking about Table 1, page 84, and we're really just talking about what are we looking at? And I don't want you to have to look at this because I will explain it, but I'm talking about how, in general, what it looks like when you have a table, a regression table, and you're trying to figure out what it means. The first part is you often see marks by the numbers, right? In this case, it's stars. So the more stars you see, the more significant. And I don't mean that it is more significant. I mean it's more statistically significant. And we won't really talk about that. That's a 302 lecture. But what we're saying is these factors, these variables, have an impact on the behavior. So what we find is first is that per capita income. The more money per individual, right? Per capita means per person. The more money per person means that the likelihood of this slide is off, I apologize. But it means that the likelihood of conflict decreases. So if you are earning more, right? If you're earning more and you're starting to do better and the economy is starting to improve, then you're less likely to less likely to engage in warfare, right? Why are you less likely to engage in warfare? For very obvious reasons. The better off you are, the more money you're making, the more financially stable you are, the more you are putting at risk by becoming a violent actor, right? If you have very little, right? If you have very little income, you don't have a lot to lose by going to war. But if you have a good job, you don't want to go to war because you have more to lose in that process, right? Or you might lose your business, you might lose your resource. So the better the as per capita income, as the economy gets better for the individuals, right, then they are much less likely to go to war. So we see this as being negative and being significant in the table. We also see a lot of other things that are significant, right? Population is significant. The more people there are, the more people can fight, right? So population should be expected, but it's not really that informative. Mountains, right? How do we know rough terrain? Well, how do we operationalize this, right? We're talking about how do we do this scientifically. So we really need some idea of what it means to be rough terrain. Rough terrain, we're going to say the percentage of the land that is mountainous. So we say, oh yeah, mountains matter. If there's more mountains, then it's easier to hide in caves. It's easier to get away from tanks. So the more mountains, the more permissive it is for rebel groups to go into conflict. Oil exporter we talked about, right? If you have oil, then that's something that you can fight over, right? Yes, you want the economy to do better, but you want it to be sort of everyone working in that system. When you have an oil resource, or it engages in this resource curse that we talked about, then all of a sudden you're not fighting for jobs in which you're willing to work and not engage in violent behavior. Because the oil is something that you can steal, now we're seeing violence against each other in order to gain control of that resource. And then the last part is a new state, right? New states don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the bureaucracy, they don't have the state capacity to resist these permissive conditions, right? And these conditions all exist under this banner of what makes it possible for rebel and insurgent groups to fight and not be captured and killed right away. So all of these are very, very permissive for a conflict. What matters for us is that ethnic fractionalization was not significant. You living in a very ethnically divided society, whether it's ethnic, religious, right? The division between Sunnis and Shias, the division between Hutus and Tutsis, that's not really what's driving the conflict. And we see this time and time again, right, that Fearon and Laitin really make this argument that we always see this ethnic division as the problem, but that's not really the problem. It's the underlying factors that you have driving these divisions. If there's nothing to gain from creating these divisions, then you wouldn't have them in the first place. And there would still be a difference between the two ethnicities, but there wouldn't be anything to fight over, right? Remember that we talked about in the last lecture, politicians have an incentive to capitalize and sort of magnify these divisions between two ethnic groups. If I want my ethnic group to vote for me and not someone else, right, I'm going to magnify divisions between myself and some other group. And so when you see elections, right, elections cause these to be increased. And when you see an authoritarian regime or dictatorship, right, the dictator or the authoritarian is going to benefit their ethnic group over other ethnic groups. And so that's going to also create some tension. But it's the policies, it's the economy, it's the resources that can be fought over that are driving this. It's not the division itself, right? Ethnic division does not drive conflict. The other factors drive conflict. And ethnic fractionalization is just an easy cognitive shortcut for humans. We can say you're different from me. And because it's very easy to say we're different and say that person is different, right? And say I'm Sunni and someone else is Shia, I can say you're Shia and I'm not. You're part of that outgroup. I can push you aside. I can make rules that keep you from getting resources. And that allows this division to exist, but it's not being driven by the true ethnic division. It's being driven by other factors. And that's really important for us to see, because if we're looking at conflict, we want to know why these conflicts occur, especially subnational conflicts, because they're much more likely than interstate conflicts as we go past the 1990s, right? Subnational conflicts are still very common. Interstate conflicts where two states actually go to war have decreased rapidly, right? It's much less likely for two states to go to war. They have other reasons, and we'll talk about this when we go into domestic audiences, right? States have different calculations than people. So let's talk about policy implications. So Fearon and Laitin make this argument, it's not a magic bullet, but The easiest way, which should be very obvious from this discussion, from this lecture I just given, that if you have a grievance between two ethnic groups, it's not easy to resolve that grievance between those ethnic groups. But if you have discriminatory policies attached, right, if you have a policy in which only someone who is Catholic can be in certain power and certain positions of power, then that discriminatory policy that excludes other groups, right, is going to cause more tension. And so the easiest way to do that is to create policies that aren't discriminatory. We've seen this in every conflict and every sort of civil war ethnic conflict, that there were policies of the government that were discriminatory. Either certain groups didn't get benefits, certain groups weren't protected by law, certain groups were prevented from getting certain resources. Whatever it is, right, the policy implication is you just need to have a rule of law that applies universally to everyone. And that's not surprising, but it will matter that that policy doesn't always get enacted, right? A lot of states still will use discriminatory policies. They might be using it to get reelected, right? If we're talking about a democratic state, right, we're talking about a state which are trying to win. So they might use discriminatory policies, right? Even in the US, we have anti-immigration policy, or it might be in other states, right? In far right-wing states. In France, Le Pen was very much against people allowing them to wear the hijab or headscarves or whatever the language that we want to use. A lot of states have said you need to be taking off headwear when you go into certain governmental buildings. Clearly discriminatory policy that causes a lot of tension. Now, I'm not suggesting that those groups will become violent. I'm just saying that those are clear discriminatory policies. And because those policies are discriminatory, we should expect to be more tensions between these ethnic divisions. But it's not the ethnic divisions, it's the policies that's driving that. So it's very important to understand those differences. The next part we're going to talk about is domestic audience costs. And I only have 2 slides here, and that's because I really want you to understand the process by which this occurs and worry less about if you didn't get sort of the math or the game theory. Don't worry about that. It's much more advanced than is necessary for this course. But the other part about it, the logical part, the argument that exists, is very important for us. The first part, right, is we know how conflict occurs according to Fearon. Fearon has made this argument before. We read it early in the semester. But let's talk about specifically this incentive to misrepresent. Now, here's the thing, is right now in this article, we're only talking about interstate war. These are 2 state actors. These are not civil wars. So we went from subnational conflict, and now we're talking about interstate conflict. Why is it important that we're talking about interstate conflict? Because states always have an incentive to misrepresent, but they have to misrepresent their willingness to fight. Now, all groups want to misrepresent their willingness to fight, but for states, they have a different process that they might use. And we see this through a process called signaling. You do something or you say something to suggest to the other actor, right, whoever it is, right, and we're going to use the example of the United States in Iraq in the next slide, but the point is that you're trying to signal to the other state. Now, why might it be a problem if the United States is trying to signal to Iraq in its rhetoric is that the domestic audience will hear that statement or that behavior. So whenever a democracy starts behaving in such a way that they want to change the status quo or they want another state to change their behavior, right? You have 2 states interacting, is that the domestic audience hears this, and the domestic audience are actors, right? This is not realism, right? This is liberalism or constructivism, right? So when we're talking about Fearon's argument, we're talking about sort of a more liberal argument, liberal theory. The domestic actors play a part, and because domestic actors are hearing this rhetoric, they're hearing these policies, they're seeing this behavior, that they're going to take this up. So domestic actors matter and domestic audiences matter here. And then the other part is state structure. So state structure is the regime, and that can be a dictatorship, it can be a democracy. How is the government structured? How are the rules structured for the state, right? In the domestic sphere, right? How is the government set up in the domestic side of this? And it really matters as we go into this example. So the example is this theoretical process, right? And I'm going to talk you through it and then I will be available from 2:30 to 5 for a chat. If you have any questions, you can email me, and we'll talk about this more than once. I don't want to just breeze past this and never come back to it. So we're going to do a review. We're going to continue the reviews with this process. So what happens is you have the status quo. We talked about the status quo. It's just the world as it is, right? If you could look at the world right now, right, COVID-19 world is the status quo. Right now we are in a status quo where you don't go out as much, you self-isolate, right? This is our current status quo. So it's not that it's permanent, it's at this moment, this is the status quo. So in the 1990s, right, the status quo exists, right? That Iraq and Kuwait are different states. Saddam Hussein is in power. George H.W. Bush, right? George Herbert Walker Bush, the older Bush, is president, and Kuwait is a state right just south of Iraq. So Saddam Hussein and his government, they decide, right, the Iraqi state led by Saddam Hussein, they decide that they want to take over Kuwait. What we think is through resources, but the argument they use is irredentism, which we've talked about, is they make this argument that Kuwait is part of Iraq, so they should be able to control it. So they start moving their troops. So Iraq signals to the world that they're going to invade Kuwait. The United States demands Iraq not to invade Kuwait. They say, no, you should not do that. We have a security agreement with Kuwait, but also they make this moral argument. They make the moral argument that you should not be invading another state, that Kuwait is sovereign. We see this again with Russia and the Crimea. The U.S. is not going to involve because we didn't have a security agreement, but we're using this example because the article uses this example. So the Iraqi state, led by Saddam Hussein, does not stop its invasion plans. And I say invasion plans because, right, you don't really see an invasion by Iraq, but it has a lot more to do with the military supremacy of the United States. So Iraq starts launching missiles, they start moving towards the border of Kuwait, right? They signal that they are definitely going to fight. And so one of the things is that both states need to ramp up their willingness to fight each other. Iraq says it will fight the United States. Now we know from then and from now that the Iraqi military cannot stand up to the US military. Both states knew it. It was very obvious, right, the military. But Iraq had to say, we're willing to fight, to sort of misrepresent, to push for this issue and hope the United States was not willing to fight. So the United States had to say it was willing to fight as a form of deterrence, but would it really fight? Would it really come to the aid of Kuwait? So the next part is that because the United States is a democracy, it has to go through a two-step process for going to war. So when the United States or any democracy goes to war, it has to go through these two steps. The first is it has to dehumanize the opponent, right? And what you see is this dehumanization where you start declaring that the Iraqis, but more importantly Saddam Hussein, right? Because you don't have to say all Iraqis are bad, you just have to say the leadership is bad. So you start having a comparison by President Bush between Saddam Hussein and Hitler. And his advisors very, very quickly say, whoa, 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 you don't want to make this comparison. And the reason they make this argument that you don't want to have this comparison is because the plan is just to defend Kuwait and repel any invasion from Iraq. But if you continue to say that Saddam Hussein is this horrible guy, as we see in 2003 with the George Bush Jr., right, George Walker Bush, right, or George W. Bush, the president between 2000 and 2008, that if you continue to dehumanize Saddam Hussein, or if you make him seem like too much of a villain, then the United States will start to demand that you remove Saddam Hussein from power. And at that time, in the 1992, in the first president, excuse me, 1991, because in 1992 he's not president, but when George Herbert Walker Bush is president, he doesn't want to take over or cause regime change in Iraq. So he has to walk back some of this rhetoric. So domestic audiences really start to take this in, and a democracy has to take that into account. Am I pushing too hard for conflict? Am I not pushing hard enough? I want to dehumanize my opponent so my domestic audience is willing to fight, but I don't want to vilify the opponent so much that they feel that we should wipe that state off the earth, right? We had such a strong animosity towards the Soviets during the Cold War, and it was necessary to convince the public that we should continue this process of this division between the Soviets and the US, right? The Soviets were bad guys, and so we had to stop them. So dehumanization can come in many forms, right? This specific case was President Bush calling Saddam Hussein Hitler, right? Remember, this is Bush Sr., which I hate that it's confusing, but I apologize. That we had two presidents named Bush, right? Father and son. The next part is you need to make a moral argument. If you're a democracy, you need to make a moral argument. So you're making this moral argument that Kuwait deserves protection for two different reasons. The first is that we have a security agreement. So you say we need to honor our agreements. We need to defend the Kuwaitis because we said we would. The second part, right, because should we really defend the Kuwaitis, right? We know that the U.S. didn't think Kuwaitis were as important as Americans, right? They're Kuwaiti, right? They're perceived as Muslim or Arab. So there's a lot of animosity about, I shouldn't say animosity, there's a lot of indifference about those people, right? Who is human is still problematic. But here's the other part is, one, should we hold up to our agreements? Who is human became a much bigger factor because the Bush presidency, that administration, was able to convince the American public that these people, and at a minimum, deserve to live in their own country and have their own sovereign lives and be protected. So why we should hold up to our agreements didn't work as well. The argument that these are people and they deserve protection did, right? This moral argument worked. And because democracies often have to deal with this moral argument, it creates both an impetus for strong, great powers like the U.S. to go in as humanitarian intervention, like we talked about during Fenimore, but it also has this problem where if you're in a democracy and you're saying we wanted to go in another state, it will often lead you to back down, right? Domestic audiences will punish you if you escalate to conflict and then you back down. And this becomes a really big problem that Fearon talks about, is if you're a state and you're a leader of a state, and you've ramped up this argument that they're bad guys, right? If you look at George W. Bush between 2003 and 2005, he talks about Iran and North Korea being this axis of evil. So not going into Iran and North Korea when they're evil, when they're the bad guys, right, is very problematic. So if you cause that escalation and then you don't do that, everyone thinks, well, why didn't we go into Iran? Why didn't we do this process? But that's driven by this rhetoric that comes from the president and democracy saying, oh, whoa, 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 you have to convince us, so if you escalate, we're going to punish you, but also we don't want to go to war, right? Democracies are less likely to war. It's a democratic peace theory, but not just with democracies, that the public doesn't want to support a conflict. So let's review really quickly as we're talking about this, and what matters here when we're talking about domestic audience costs is that it follows a very clear process, right? Both states have an incentive to misrepresent. What they're misrepresenting is not the military, right? Because we know Iraq and the United States is very obvious who has a stronger military at any time period. But what they're trying to hide is how willing they are to fight. George Bush Sr. not nearly as willing to fight as his son. His son much more willing to go into Iraq and have an occupation. George Bush Sr., being former director of the CIA, was looking for a sort of surgical operation, just come in and sort of quick strike, take care of the threat, and then get out of there. So their willingness to fight was very different, but they had to hide that. You never want to show your true willingness to fight. You hide that behavior. The next part is signaling. You want to make it seem to your opponent, to the other state, the other actor in the system, right? We're talking about the international system, that you're willing to fight, that you're capable, and you're going to stop them from that behavior. But when you signal to a foreign actor, it's impossible not to have a domestic audience. There is no way a leader of a country can say something to signal to another country without their domestic audience hearing. And because the domestic audience always hears, right, the state structure will determine how that actor will behave. If you're a democracy, you have to be very, very careful about what you say because your domestic population can influence your behavior moving forward. If they don't like what you're saying, you're going to have to change, whether it's because you're worried about re-elections or it's because you have other factors, right? In the United States, we have Congress, right? So even if the president says something, Congress can try and stop that behavior. So domestic audiences really matter depending on the structure that you have. If you're a dictator, you don't care about domestic audiences. Your domestic audience doesn't have a vote in your regime. So if your state structure is that you rule by yourself, or you rule as sort of a big coalition or even oligarchy like the Russians, right? You don't really care about what the domestic audience is saying unless it's going to impact you to such a point that you lose power. So democracies are much more likely to back down. They're much more likely to avoid escalation. And we talked about why would they be more likely to avoid isolation is because of this domestic audience punishment, right? If you escalate and then back down, if you start the fight and then you back out of it, right, a domestic audience will punish you. And democracies, their domestic audience is more capable of punishing than other audiences. So that's the domestic audiences article. We're only going over it briefly because there's a lot of game theory. I don't want you to get bogged down in the game theory. The other part we talked about, right, I'm going very quickly through this, with this Fearon and Laitin piece on ethnicity, insurgency, and civil war. And as we saw, right, the first part is that civil wars are much more likely than interstate wars. This is 1999, so by today's standards, right, even less interstate wars, right, even more civil conflicts and subnational conflicts, right? And the conventional wisdom that it was driven by ethnic diversity or ethnic fractionalization. But what we see, and I know I'm going very quickly, but this is just a review, right, is that it's really driven by state capacity. Can the state actually stop rebel groups? Is there rough terrain, and are they supported financially by an outside actor, right? And these are called permissive conditions, right? It is not that conflict is more likely in an ethnically diverse community. It is that when you have these conditions, when you have a weak or failed state, when you have a lot of mountain ranges, it makes it easier for insurgencies to fight, and because it's easier for those insurgencies to fight, their cost-benefit analysis changes. So they start making the argument, right, that, and this is the data, I apologize, they start making the argument that it's easier for an insurgency group to be successful under these conditions, and therefore you would see a conflict that is more likely. So that's the lecture for today. I will be in as I talked about, I will be in the chat, but also I want you to go through these lectures, and I want you to look at the slides, right? It's fine for you to minimize this and just hear what I'm saying going through the slides. If you can't follow along, right, if you're having technological problems, please contact me. I didn't get any more emails about the file, but I noticed that Antonio, thank you very much for uploading it, right, made another accessible way to get to that text. So I really fought against buying text, but it bit me because now I can't interact with you. But since we're online, if you continue to have technical issues, I'm always here to talk. I should have a lot of stuff graded, and then we do have an exam coming up, so make sure you're communicating with me, make sure you're watching the videos, make sure you're reading the material, because the exam should be getting easier, but don't plan on just coasting to the course, right? There's a lot of difficulty in the exam too, so be ready, be prepared as you can, and continue to communicate with me if you have issues. I know there's going to be internet outages. I know there's going to be other health issues, right? The whole reason we're shut down is because of a health issue. So if you have something going on, communicate it with me and I will work with you. All right, thank you.